So I recently had my starter go out on me on my N52 equipped E90. So one day before the starter died, it took 2 more cranks to start the engine. And the next morning when I tried to turn the car on again, it cranked the same amount of times, but on the last crank it just faded away and then it stopped cranking. When I pushed the start button again, there was no sound at all. And that's when I realized that my starter had failed. And I just wanted to share some tips with you of how I was able to replace it myself. For the starter replacement, I actually recommend taking out the intake manifold, since it gives you a lot more room to get access to the bolts and all the wiring. So when removing the intake manifold, you'll have more room if you remove the power steering bracket that's mounted on by these 3 screws that I put back in place so I don't lose them. And then this hose actually mounts on top of these 2 holes, of these 2 screws. There's the power steering reservoir moved out of the way, and this hose is actually connected to here. You just release it by pressing down on the white tab. Looks like that. When removing the intake manifold from the engine, you'll have a series of these bolts. So there will be 3 studs that go here, 1, 2, 3, and the rest will be bolts. Basically, this will be the bolt, and then this would be the stud. So usually this comes off first. The nut will come off, and then you'll have the stud sticking out of the engine, and it actually will get in the way of removing your intake manifold easily. You have to pull it past this stud. I just got an E6 socket and took it out. These are torqued down to 11 pound-feet. When I was taking apart the intake manifold, I labeled all of the wires and hoses so I would know where they would go. And this oil return line for the PCV valve was very hard to get out because it was in a really weird location. And these push clips, push to lock, are pretty hard to get to. So basically there are 2 locks on the side. There's one right here and one right here. And when you push on the ridges, it loosens it, and then you can pull the hose off. And then it's also connected with this wire into a box in the intake manifold, and this is also connected in that same box for the intake manifold. This PCV hose, return hose, actually goes under here, right over here. And then these you don't have to touch when removing the intake manifold. There's just one little connector that is this one that connects over to here. This is the back of the intake manifold, so this is where your firewall would be. And there's a clip right here that holds the fuel rail. And then there is also this clip that holds this power cable. The fuel rail is, or the fuel line is this one. It clips on roughly around here, and it locks into here. So this is also that box I talked about, where the wire goes from this hose and from here. from the junction box. This is the one from the junction box right here. That one, so there's actually 4 holes right here. The junction box one goes on the bottom, so the first one. And then the second one is where that lower hose plugs into. This third one is for the hose that goes into the valve cover. And this hose connects back here, and it's really hard to get to, and it's hard to remove, especially if your car is a higher mileage. So that's the original valve cover PCV hose that broke when I tried to remove it. So this part basically came off. And this piece was around $80 for the genuine BMW part. So the last one actually goes into the PCV valve. So when removing these wires, all you have to do is get a flathead, wedge it under here, and then you just lift it up so it releases from the lock, and then pull straight out. So there's this little locking tab right here that goes into the little hole. So you just have to get it high enough to release from there and just pull straight out. A lot of people have trouble getting this junction box off of the intake manifold, so what I did was just, instead of taking it out from the locking tabs, I just took out the Torx, the T27, I believe. It's either a 25 or a 27 from the intake manifold. There's one in the front right here and one in the back over here. So the junction box screws are, it's a T27 Torx, and it just goes in right here into the threaded hole, like so. And to take the starter out of the engine, you would actually need a E14 or E-Torx. It's a E14 socket. So there's one bolt in the front of the starter and one bolt in the back, on the back of the starter. So it's right here. The front one is right over here. You just get an extension and go in right here and loosen it. For the back one, it's a little bit harder since it faces towards the firewall of the car. And I actually bought this tool just for that purpose, since it's a very slim design, because I was researching online and people actually used a flex head ratchet and was able to take the rear bolt out, but I wasn't able to. So basically when you go in, it goes in right here. I wasn't able to get this on all the way. It was mostly just hanging out halfway. So I actually had to use a 11mm 12-point wrench to get into that bolt. The 11mm wrench fits perfectly on the bolt. So this is what the new Bosch starter sounds like.